that's it. Let's go.
Live stream?
Everything. I'll wait until you've got names up, and then we'll start.
You have the cup.
Nearer. Oh, really near. Okay.
I will just... No, I want to show. No, I want to show when I speak. I want to advertise. So what do I say?
Okay.
Yeah, but I am.
Okay.
This is live stream.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this global campaign to demand climate justice opening press conference. My name is Sarah Shaw from Friends of the Earth International. We're a member of Demand Climate Justice, as are our other distinguished panelists today. We have Meena Rahman from Third World Network, Friends of the Earth Malaysia, Nona Chai from the Just Transition Alliance, Carola Mejia from Latindad, and Rachel Rose Jackson from Corporate Accountability. And I want to start by declaring that I have no ties to the fossil fuel industry or to other polluting industries, and no conflicts of interest, and I invite others to do the same. I also want to acknowledge the ongoing genocides in Palestine, Sudan, and Congo. There can be no climate justice while these genocides endure, and we must fight to stop them. As climate impacts continue to escalate with extreme impact events such as heatwaves, droughts, wildfires, and floods, disproportionately impacting vulnerable populations in the global south, and with climate denialism at its peak, the defining question for Cop30 is whether global north countries are willing to cooperate with the global south and deliver their fair share of climate action by paying their climate debt, rejecting false solutions and dangerous distractions, and enabling a truly equitable, just transition towards ending fossil fuels and building just renewable energy systems that put people at the centre. I'd like to turn, first of all, to Meena Rahman of Third World Network to give us an update on the negotiations, talk about finance and other things that have been happening. Thank you, Meena.
Good morning. You can hear me loud and clear? First, I'd like to declare that we don't have any ties to the fossil fuel industry or other polluting industries, and also declare that we don't have any conflict of interest. When I say we, I mean the Third World Network. Now, there's a lot of talk about saving multilateralism, and particularly I think the context is very important as we are here celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And there's also a lot of talk about how those countries who are committed to staying true to the Paris Agreement, unlike the United States, which has denied, the Trump administration, to be clear, has denied climate change as a problem, and who's actually steering the rest of the world on a course to catastrophe. Now, while we are here, the optics about saving multilateralism and what we hear outside, it's really important to recognize that it's not saving multilateralism at any cost. We have to be true to saving multilateralism so that the planet and the poor do not suffer further consequences. So at the talks here, one of the big issues in the halls is about the call by several countries, including developed and developing countries, for various agenda items on the opening day of the plenary. Now, these agenda items relate to Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which is about the financial obligations, mandatory financial obligations for developed countries to provide the finance, a call that has been made by the G77 and China in unity together, recognizing that this is one of the most important aspects to implement. So what is the push for is a space to discuss the provision of finance, and not just about mobilizing finance from all actors and without any consequence in terms of a real provision. So this is where developed countries are saying we don't want this to be discussed. And so this is one of the divergence, that big divergence and big, what do you call it? I'm getting very blurry-eyed at this moment, but a big gap. They talk about the gap, the implementation gap, the ambition gap, but they don't want to talk about the provision of Article 9.1 in terms of a political space to discuss that. The other is the issue about unilateral trade measures. Now, we talk about multilateralism, but there's a lot of unilateral measures that are being taken, like the EU, the European Union's carbon border measures, which is also, other countries are also thinking about it, including Canada, Australia, and others. Now, these unilateral measures, the question here is, are they about protectionism, or are they about promoting multilateralism? So the issue here is, are we in a space, a multilateral space, for competition or for cooperation? I think this is our overall approach to this process. So those who are committed to the Paris Agreement, are they here to compete and not honor obligations, or are they here to actually cooperate in making things happen? So the two other items which are being discussed at the presidency consultations, the other is on the synthesis report of the nationally determined contributions. For those of you who are not familiar, parties have come out with new nationally determined contributions, which they have forwarded. Most countries have forwarded. There's still a number who haven't. So there's a synthesis report. The question here is, you don't need a synthesis report to tell you that parties are off track in meeting the climate ambition. Now, the question is, who will meet the mitigation gap, the emissions gap? Now, this largely falls on the global north, who have overused the atmospheric space from historical emissions, and they are now talking about how their NDCs are 1.5 aligned. That's a lie. That's a falsehood, because it can't be when your nationally determined contribution is not within your fair share. So civil society has a deep analysis about this, of how these countries are not doing their fair share. So when you talk about the synthesis report, we have to get serious. It's a common but differentiated responsibility. We are not all on the same, we are on the same boat, but there is a differentiation between developed and developing countries, and historical responsibility is on the global north. The final push that the NDC proposal is actually from the Alliance of Small Island States. The other proposal which is being discussed is on the biennial transparency reports. This is about reporting. How do you report what you're achieving? Now, this is a proposal by the European Union. Many developing countries had agreed for enhanced reporting. Many of them have capacity constraints, and so there are challenges. But what is it that the European Union wants to talk about? Is it to push more burdens? Is it to not differentiate developed and developing countries? So this is the problem. Is this cooperation of real, genuine kind? Like the ICJ, the International Court of Justice opinion was a duty of states to cooperate, particularly in international cooperation. So is it international cooperation, or is it combat, might is right, the powerful rule, and the global north once again escape from their obligations? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meena. We're going to now turn to Nona Chai of the Just Transition Alliance, who's going to talk about just transition developments here.
I am Nona Chai from the Just Transition Alliance and the global campaign to demand climate justice. I want to declare that I have no direct ties to the fossil fuel industry or other emissions-intensive industries, and no conflicts of interest. Just transition matters for workers, indigenous peoples, and affected communities because the world is at a crossroads. We can continue with business as usual and create our own destruction, or we can co-create a society where those most harmed lead on decisions that impact them, where indigenous traditional practices, clean, safe workplaces, and local regenerative economies provide and thrive. We need to stop the real and physical violence against indigenous peoples and affected communities. We need a just transition that cares for all. When the UAE Just Transition Work Program was first established, we were among the many who saw its broad scope agreed to by parties as a promising development. A just transition cannot be possible without recognizing the different dimensions and challenges faced by workers, indigenous peoples, and communities in the transition away from fossil fuels, especially in developing countries. This includes poverty eradication, sustainable development, adapting to the impacts of climate change, and protecting and empowering all vulnerable and affected workers, indigenous peoples, communities, and sectors. The scope of the UAE JTWP was not only broad enough to address these issues, but also laid the foundations for developing concrete outcomes and actions for people on the ground. However, since its establishment, the JTWP has yet to deliver on its promise. It has become bogged down in endless debate, grandstanding, and poor facilitation. DCJ believes that this is a make or break year for just transition in the UNFCCC. Another COP without actionable decisions on just transition will render the JTWP into a permanent talk shop not worth renewing after it expires in 2026. Either the JTWP fulfills its promise or it becomes another failed work stream obstructing the international response to climate crisis. We strongly welcome the G77 adoption of the proposal to establish a just transition mechanism, very similar to civil society's proposal for a Belem action mechanism that aims to achieve a holistic just transition across the whole economy within and between countries. The G77's mechanism proposal incorporates many of the functions of the BAM that we, including DCJ, have been arguing for. Coordination of just transition initiatives within and outside the UNFCCC, supporting action and provision of technical assistance and MOI for implementing just transitions, especially in the Global South, and knowledge sharing and creation. This mechanism can serve as a space to initiate action on all dimensions of just transition, including energy transition, critical minerals, food and agricultural systems, care work, and others. But where is the Global North's ambition for establishing necessary institutional arrangements? The Global North is failing to support a new institutional mechanism for fear of overlap and administrative costs. The world needs the Global North to step up and fund a non-debt creating just transition in order to break historical patterns of harm. Because of climate change, costs for states and billions of displaced and affected workers, indigenous peoples, communities will continue to rise. We are witnessing this with the increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters, including in Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, Alaska, Egypt, and the Philippines, and more. We cannot allow more lives, livelihoods, and species to be lost. The Global North claims that a mechanism already exists and that just transition is in everything. However, the popularization of just transition does not ensure its success, and mainstreaming just transition across all UNFCCC mechanisms does not preclude parties from creating a dedicated home for just transition. We need a powerful and inclusive institutional center to create focus, clarify definitions, and distribute resources for just transition. Most importantly, this mechanism must create the conditions for a principled and just transition away from extractive economies and a fossil fuel phase-out. We urge all parties to ensure that the mechanism is both guided by principles that protect and promote the rights of all sectors and includes the formal representation of observer constituencies in the UNFCCC and civil society. There can be no just transition without the leadership and agency of workers, indigenous peoples, communities, youth, and all affected sectors. Furthermore, DCJ is calling for the removal of language on nature-based solutions in the current informal note of the JTWP that will be the basis of a COP decision. NBS is often used as an umbrella term covering a range of schemes for climate and biodiversity protection. The concept is so vague that it has also referred to various false solutions that violate the rights and territories of indigenous peoples and communities, as well as destroying ecosystems. As our colleagues and Friends of the Earth have said, NVS is a wolf in sheep's clothing, a dangerous idea in disguise. Just transition decisions must enshrine the collective rights of indigenous peoples, which include but are not limited to UNDRIP and ILO Convention 169. DCJ joins the growing chorus of movements rejecting all false climate solutions. There can be no just transition with false solutions. Just transition can only be with real solutions such as agroecology and locally governed food systems. A just transition must recognize and ensure the implementation of the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas as recognized in the United Nations Declaration UNDROP. We have the solutions. Let's follow paths laid by principles of environmental justice, the Hermes principles for democratic organizing, the Bali principles of climate justice, and the indigenous principles of just transition, well-established documents within the environmental justice movement. Let's co-create a future where everyone can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nona. We're now going to hear from Carola Mejia of Latindad around carbon markets and false solutions.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, when we come to these climate negotiations, the only thing we see moving forward are the false solutions. Carbon markets are one of those. And unfortunately, to really tackle the climate emergency, we need to reduce 43% of the global emissions until 2030. What is happening? They keep rising. They are increasing. That's because the big polluters have incentives to keep polluting if they pay for just compensating their offsetting their emissions. And that is exactly what carbon markets does. It gives the opportunity to big polluters to keep polluting if they pay, and they can even get profit for it. So we don't need net zero, we need real zero to tackle the climate emergency, and that is why carbon markets are a false solution. That is also causing a lot of problems in the communities. This year in Bolivia, for example, that opened to the carbon markets, we had a case where 3 indigenous communities were scammed by foreign people that went to their territories, offered some money to have access to 500,000 hectares of their territory. They have even signed the contract and everything under the premises of the carbon market, and it was all false. Another instrument related to nature financialization and markets is the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, which is supposed to be a Global South proposal from Brazil and others, but it's really not. It has conceived 15 years ago at the World Bank, and it considers deforestation a market failure that will be solved if you put a price on the ecosystem tropical forest to attract private investment. And we think that the ecological collapse caused by capitalism will be never solved by more capitalism. It intends to generate $4 billion annually to distribute $4 per hectare to the governments that show that they are preserving forests. But is $4 per hectare really a good amount of money, an adequate figure? Of course not, because it does not recognize forests as a living system so fragile and so important for the planet. The TFFF does not seek to address the true structural causes of forest deforestation. It does not propose effective measures to curb and reverse extractivism in our territories. It is a mechanism for privatizing the forest finance. But if only 1% of the $2.7 trillion of public fund spent in wars and genocides this year could go allocated to climate action, 27 billion could be made available annually to really preserve forests, to really tackle the climate emergency. That's more than 6 times the 4 billion this TFFF would like to generate. And according to recent analysis from colleagues in the South, imposing a tax of just $1 per barrel of oil could rise 10 times more per year than the $4 billion the TFF is trying to collect annually. And it doesn't really prioritize indigenous people because it's proposing that 80% of what is going to be collected will go to the governments and only 20% will go to the indigenous communities and local communities. There are not going to be controls established to use the money received by the governments that could be benefited from the mechanism, so it's not going to be transparent as well. And many other questions arise from these kind of mechanisms. Who will be responsible for the debt created by this investment fund? What happens if the target amount is not reached? The fund could be liquidated if exceptional financial or other situations arises. It's a lot of risks only to have a solution. And this solution is arising because global north countries are not fulfilling their obligations. And as Mina was saying, they have the obligations to provide fair climate finance without debt to the global south countries that are facing the impacts of the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carola. And yes, just to reiterate, Demand Climate Justice has taken a really strong position against TFFF. Friends of the Earth has taken a really strong position against TFFF. We have publications here. We're happy to talk more about that and about our opposition to that. I'd finally like to introduce Rachel Rose Jackson from Corporate Accountability, who's going to talk about the big picture and also about our work on kicking big polluters out.
Is this working? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I also would like to disclose that I have no conflicts of interest, no direct ties to the fossil fuel industry or other polluting industries. And frankly, I wonder why everyone, not just in this room, but in these halls, is not taking the time to declare the same. I also want to just first up acknowledge how complicated all of this sounds. It's all very technical. All of these updates that we've just heard from all of my colleagues are, I think, just illustrate how significantly difficult it is to understand anything that's happening in almost any one of these rooms on almost any one of these agenda items. I have to admit, I often don't know exactly what's happening myself, and this is coming from someone who's followed these negotiations for over a decade. And in fact, I still have nightmares about my first Article 6 negotiations some years ago, where I came close to crying trying to understand exactly what everything meant. So everything that's in these halls feels very technical, very confusing, and very complicated. And I think it's really important that we first understand that this is by design. It's everything that's happening in these halls, everything that's being debated in seemingly foreign, never before heard languages in all of these negotiating rooms is part of a carefully orchestrated plan to create a fake alternate reality that creates a complete disconnect from the reality of the world that we're all living and the climate crisis that we're all experiencing outside of these halls. This is an intentional plan to create disconnect from the typhoons that are currently happening in the Philippines while we are here, where hundreds of people are dying, and many activists here are not even sure if their families are safe or if they'll come home to a community that was the same as it left. This is a plan to create intentional disconnect from the trillions of dollars that are being spent annually on war and fossil fuel genocide in Palestine, but also other places around the world. This is an intentional plan to create disconnect from the wildfires, from the floods, from the grabbed lands, from the harm caused all around the world by the very same actors that are here creating this disconnect. This process has been designed this way, and it's really not a coincidence. This is an intentional and carefully orchestrated illusion crafted by the very same countries that are most responsible for climate change and most responsible for the past 3 decades of blocking progress to address it. I'm talking about global north countries like the United States, governments like the European Union, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, have all caused the emissions and profited off of those emissions increasing activities at the expense of people across the world, particularly global south communities, frontline communities, and indigenous peoples. So if it's helpful, I'm going to try to spell out a little bit clearly in layperson terms some of what's happening here and just underscore some of what my colleagues have shared in much more depth. What's happening here at Cop30 is the systematic denial of the trillions of dollars that is overdue in climate debt by the global north countries to the global south. This debt is not charity. It's not kindness, it's owed, and it's long overdue. But this is being denied, withdrawn, and drawn back across all elements of finance discussions here. There's then the systematic withdrawal of all other forms of meaningful finance that's public, people-centered, in the control of communities, and instead the rolling out and ramping up of carbon markets and other climate finance schemes that only allow these countries and other polluters to continue to pollute and continue to profit off of these pollution. And then, of course, there's the pretense of the TFFF, which, as we've heard, is nothing but riddled with loopholes and another attempt to profit off of nature. This is all well at home. These same global north countries are not actually doing things to decrease emissions or to do their fair share of climate action, but are actually scaling up fossil fuel production and other things. Just last week, research by Oil Change International showed that actually just 4 global north countries have derailed oil and gas phase out since the Paris Agreement. And these 4 countries have increased their oil and gas production by 40% between 2015, when the Paris Agreement was agreed, and last year. The rest of the world, just for comparison, in this time, has a combined oil and gas decrease of 2%. Who are we talking about? Who are these countries that are to blame? Well, it's not those we might be hearing being blamed in these negotiating rooms. Again, it's the global north. And these 4 countries that are most responsible for derailing climate action through their increased production of fossil fuels at home are Canada, Australia, Norway, and the United States. Which brings me to the United States. Let's talk about them, because they're not here, right? No, that's incorrect. Let's be clear. The United States has always been the largest blocker of climate action at home and abroad, and they have always been the biggest bully. They may not be officially here, but they are very here in all of the ways that matter, undermining action. And the fact that they don't have an official delegation doesn't change that. They're here as the biggest donors to the World Bank, which is now the interim trustee and host of both the TFFF as well as the Loss and Damage Fund. So they hold the purse strings as some of the biggest parts of climate action. And at home, they're also using tariffs and economic sanctions to weaponize climate action and to prevent other countries from being able to take the action they need to domestically to respond to the climate crisis. So the US is very much here. They've taken off the gloves and they're ready to throw down, as are their other comrades, the Canada, Australia, Norway, and the EU. But finally, it's also really important we understand that it is not only countries who are being allowed here to do dirty at Cop30. You could be forgiven for thinking, when you walk through the pavilions, that we are at a corporate trade show, because it's easy to think that way. We have one of the world's biggest industrial agriculture polluters as a diamond sponsor of the agribusiness zone, and we have many other examples of fossil fuel and big polluted interests being represented here. And in fact, Kick Big Polluters Out last week released research showing that between COP26 and COP29, more than thousands of lobbyists have attended the past climate talks, fossil fuel lobbyists. They are overrunning this place. They are everywhere. They are in the whispering in the ears of delegates. They are in rooms that even we don't have access to. And just 90 of these oil and gas corporations that have attended recent COPs are responsible for nearly 60% of oil and gas production in 2024. So what are they doing here? And if global north countries aren't getting serious about doing their fair share of climate action, what are they doing here? It's time to step up. It's time to kick big polluters out. It's time for global north countries to do their long overdue fair share and to crack that disconnect between the real world that's outside these halls and the carefully orchestrated artificial reality inside these halls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel Rose. We're almost out of time. We're not going to have time to do questions, but all of our panelists will be available outside the room to talk to the media and to discuss things further. I also wanted to highlight TWN does updates. You can scan the QR code on this postcard and receive more information. They're very informative. And just in my last sort of few seconds, in closing, I would like to really highlight and point towards events happening outside the formal COP today, the People's Summit. Right now, there is an extraordinary procession of over 200 boats along the river in Belem. And by the thousands, members of feminist, peasant, indigenous and environmental movements from across Brazil, Latin America and the world are gathering to demand an end to environmental racism and inequality and to bring true solutions to the climate crisis, to challenge the power of rich countries and corporations. Negotiators here would do well to look to the People's Summit and hear the voices and solutions of the people. Thank you very much.